Okay, we are good. The link has been tweeted. People will be funneling in. And okay, so the first, in mulling what I wanted to ask you up front, having read your book on Hillary Clinton from 2014, my just general question is, are the theories and the postulates that you laid out in that book, do you see them having been vindicated since the publication of the book? In your observations of the campaign, or how does in broad terms, how is what's transpired over the course of both the primary campaign and the general election campaign thus far comported with what you sort of prophesied in the book?
I think it all works out pretty well. I'll pat myself on the back. Do so. And I just want to. There are at least two components to my critique. One, political. She's just too centrist, too hawkish, too Wall Street friendly, too in love with American money and power for my taste. But the other part of the critique was of her lousiness as a candidate. And when I first started doing the research on Hillary back in the summer of 2014, I was on an email list for a bunch of elite liberal pundits, and they really hated me for getting involved in this. I was going to be working to elect Ted Cruz, who they thought was the front runner at that point, or perhaps their worst imagination, their worst imagined possibility. But I said, regardless, if you really want to an elected Democratic president in 2016, you really shouldn't put all your eggs in the Hillary basket. She's got a lot of problems. She's got scandals. They're always willing to blow up, ready to blow up. She's probably got scandals in the making we don't know about yet. And of course, that was before the email business popped. And she's very unlikable. People just don't like her. The more people see her, the less they like her. She's a terrible campaigner. She is prone to saying stupid things because she's really not a natural in front of an audience the way her husband was. He's not looking so good now, but even in his prime, he was really masterful. So, regardless of what you think of her politics, and you may like her politics better than I do, she's just a lousy candidate, and you're making a mistake by sort of foreclosing any possibilities of challenges to her. And the fact that the Sanders, at that point, Sanders, I don't think he'd announced quite yet, but it was remarkable. At first, 5 people, it seemed like were at his first announcement. And then suddenly his candidacy really took off and provided a real challenge to this candidate who was the favorite of the establishment, political establishment, the journalistic establishment, had been running for president for almost 40 years. But supposedly, she had an almost successful run in 2008. So, she was by most conventional measures the front runner and the unchallenged front runner, it seemed. Yet Sanders went a good bit of the way towards knocking her off, which I thought revealed just how vulnerable she was. And now, she started out the general with a fairly large lead in the polls over Trump, and now, depending on what polls you read, it's more or less tied. And it just seems that she has no way of responding to this. It's as if they didn't expect, she and her staff didn't expect a challenge during the primary season, so they're blindsided by Sanders and didn't know how to react at first. First they ran against him from the right, and they tried to co-opt him, and then they finally won. I mean, they have substantial resources and a lot of cautious voters who didn't want to take a risk on the socialist from Vermont. But then they entered the general thinking, oh, Trump, horrible guy, everybody hates him, it's going to be a walk. And it's turned out to be not that. And, they've outspent Trump like, what, $145 million to $4 million in ads so far. And they're virtually even in the polls. The Clinton people have almost, have this massive field operation, offices all over the country. Trump has almost none of that. They've got, all the establishment media on their side, despite their complaints to the contrary. And yet she's barely keeping her nose above water. It's, what I was saying, that she's just a terrible candidate, really turned out to be true.
I think I would imagine that some of the very same people who were scolding you for doing critical research on Hillary back during that early period of the campaign in 2015 2015, or
No, it
who
started in
hate
2014. It's been going on
2014,
so
right?
long.
So the same people who were scolding you for even doing preliminary research on Hillary for a critical evaluation of her back then were probably among the same people who were chastising anybody who might even begin to suggest that the email issue, quote unquote, is either on the substance of merit and worthy of scrutiny, or even from a political tactical standpoint, could present significant problems for her as a general election candidate. And something that I've noticed in going back and doing some research myself on the Clinton era is that the familiar trajectory for one of these scandals is that something relatively banal happens that's maybe a problem in a certain sense, but doesn't necessarily need to blow up into this all-consuming scandal. But then the Clintons kind of lawyer their way through it such that they develop these ever expanding rationales and half truths and weird explanations for what happened, that it kind of spirals out of control and then leads into other sectors of potential corruption or criminality once an investigation is spurred into the initial alleged misconduct. And it seems like that's a perfect, so that's what happened for, that's what led to Clinton being impeached in the 90s. And it seems like it's a similar pattern here with the email thing. I personally think that there has always been some merit to the issue itself, but the Democratic partisans and the liberals have vehemently insisted that it was just pure partisan demagoguery, and it was always this bad faith attempt to undermine Hillary. And so the issue of the emails and then the Clinton Foundation, which is related, were never really aired during the primary. So now what we have, in the past month or so, is these things coming to a head as these kind of scandalous new revelations, and I think they've damaged her poll standing relative to Trump. Do you see that as having the pattern having recurred as manifested in the email/foundation mishaps?
Yeah, I was really distressed when Sanders said, I guess it was during the first debate, I'm sick of the damn emails, because that really is an important thing. It's as you point out, a recurrent pattern in these Clinton scandals is that whatever happens, maybe a minor or something, that or an embarrassment or something that is pretty questionable, whatever, but they always make it worse by trying to evade and lie and maybe destroy documents or withhold things. It's just a classic pattern. We can go back to whitewater, a word that I'm sure drives many people to roll their eyes heavenward. But whatever the initial illegality or impropriety or whatever you want to call it was made worse by the fact that they hid documents. These documents, the billing records, that disappeared for 2 years and then suddenly showed up back again in the White House residence, like very mysteriously. So there's this long-standing pattern of doing something, trying to cover it up, lying about it, and then maybe hiding documents, even if they're under subpoena. So now we're seeing the same thing with the emails. And what's interesting about the emails was she knew exactly what she's doing. She's extremely cautious. She plans out everything. She's a very resourceful, canny politician. She's very, very smart, very well informed. She knows what she's doing. She set up that server, I believe, the day she began, that the testimony for her confirmation began. And what I believe she wanted to do was to evade public scrutiny for what she did as Secretary of State. And that could just be her desire to be secretive. She hates the press, always has hated the press. Doesn't like it. She just thinks that she's above the law, doesn't want to be scrutinized on what she's done. She doesn't want to leave any paper trail or electronic trail. And that email server fits in perfectly with that. And then additionally, when these emails were subpoenaed, she destroyed half of them. And now we're seeing that the guy who did it didn't seem to be the most competent techie. But
yeah, that's sort of a paradox, right? Because she has this reputation of being very scrupulous and very detail-oriented, but at the same time, they delegate these crucial tasks out to people who seem to be relatively incompetent. Like, apparently this guy who was based in Colorado, who was running their tech operation, had to go onto Reddit to seek guidance as to how to potentially manipulate the email archive. And then in the FBI report that came out a few weeks ago, there was the incredible revelation that one of Bill's aides ended up sending a MacBook via United States Postal Service that contained the entire archive of the Hillary emails. And then the laptop ended up mysteriously vanishing, and nobody knows where it is. So theoretically, there's a MacBook circulating out in the public somewhere that contains every email that she, traversed her server prior to the mass deletion, which we now know probably occurred under circumstances that were not, properly represented at the time.
That is true. And there are ways in which she reminds me of Richard Nixon. In the secretiveness, the deviousness, the paranoia. And it's funny, she got practically her first professional job was on the Watergate committee that ended up impeaching Nixon. So there's a neat historical closure there. But Nixon always seemed like he sort of wanted to get caught. He was doing all these sinister, plotty things, and then always would leave some little detail undone that would lead to his being embarrassed and caught. So you almost wonder as if there's a desire to be punished here that a psychoanalyst could do a lot with. But getting back to this email thing, people dismiss it. And I say it's important just because it comes out of her secretiveness and her desire to control everything and her unwillingness to be scrutinized. But, you really have to wonder what's in those 30,000 deleted emails. And my suspicion is there's some smelly stuff about the foundation there that we'll never know about now, probably. But
I mean, it's not all about yoga and granddaughters and wedding plans?
Yeah, that seems highly unlikely, shall we say, that it was just about all those things. But, of course, she's not supposed to be the one who decides that. These are supposed to be public records, and these should have been shared with the congressional panel that was subpoenaing them. And I know the Republicans are dastardly in pursuing these things. The whole Benghazi thing is insane, but there's something there. And then all these Democrats get into defending her, regardless of what the contents of the malefaction are all about. And we saw just a couple of weeks ago with her pneumonia. I mean, why couldn't they have said, she's got pneumonia, she needs to take a couple of days off? No, they lie about it. They cover it up, and then it ends up being very damaging when revealed. I mean, at least one tracking poll, I believe, that LA Times poll, which is kind of an outlier in Trump's favor, I'll say. But it showed that a real loss of her stature and a gain on Trump's that began that weekend after the pneumonia gate, I guess we can call it. But again, there's that same impulse to cover up, to lie, to deceive, and that's not really something that we want in a president. We've had so much secrecy in government, so much surveillance, increasing amount with practically every president since, since the 1960s at least. She would add to that. She would make it even worse. She's more likely to be secretive and to jack up the surveillance state from the levels that Obama did, which in many ways were greater than Bush's.
And it's ironic because a central facet of the critique that Obama leveled at Hillary in 2008 was that he was committed to transparency to a greater degree that he and Bill were. And he didn't, lay this out explicitly, but the implicit takeaway from that was that he would be a departure from some of the excessive secretive tendencies that were on display, in the Clinton administration. And then, then he appointed Hillary as Secretary of State, and she ended up bringing that whole Clintonian baggage into the State Department, which, in a real sense, kind of undermined the pledges that Obama had made to institute greater transparency in his administration. And another thing on the email, it's ironic because you'll have people like Kevin Drum at Mother Jones insist that the whole thing is a nothing burger, and there's nothing worthwhile or revelatory in the emails. Well, first of all, half of them were deleted, so we don't know what the contents of those were. But even among those that were preserved and released, I mean, the only way you can dismiss their importance so summarily like that is if, number one, you don't care about foreign policy, because especially with regard to the Libya intervention, there are emails that came out that show specifically her underlings plotting amongst themselves ways to assign her maximum credit for what was then perceived as a major success back in 2011. So that was going to be her big foreign policy triumph leading into the 2016 election, and that's reflected in the internal communications that the aides carry out amongst themselves. So, I mean, it just seems like there's a real bad faith move on the part of liberal partisans to deny on the substance that a lot of this has any meaning, and I don't get how they rationalize it.
Well, I think there are two things at work. One is they're just so committed to Hillary and her success, and have been for years now, that they will overlook anything that comes in their way. But also now they're talking up the Trump threat, and I don't like Trump. I mean, he's a scary guy, and I say that as a fairly comfortable white guy who is not going to have to worry about the immigration authorities coming after me or any of these things that, or like the kinds of informal violence that Trump seems to be exciting. It's just, he's horrible. I'm not going to say anything good about him. But they are just so convinced that he represents the second coming of Adolf Hitler that you just have to make any kind of excuse you can to deflect any criticism of Hillary Clinton. And this comes back to the fact that she's such a weak candidate.
Wouldn't they have done that regardless of the Republican candidate, really? I mean, if it was Ted Cruz or Jeb Bush or whoever, they would have, maybe the rhetoric wouldn't have been quite as overheated as it is now with the Hitler comparisons, but there would have been similar partisan pressure exerted to suppress criticism of Hillary, right?
Oh my God! Oh yes, absolutely. Actually, this goes back to I think Hal Draper wrote this essay in 1965 talking about the way the Democrats used the threat of the brown shirts coming to force people to vote for whatever distasteful candidate they're putting up that year. So this is a long-standing fear-mongering campaign going back, something like 50 years at least, that the Nazis are coming and vote Democrat no matter what the deficiencies. But it's they feel particular urgency with Hillary because it's just been striking how little positive content there is to her campaigns. And she's supposed to be Ms. Policy, she's supposed to have all these great ideas, but it's just, if you look at the proposals, there's just a lot of wonkishness to dissolve upon close examination. And most of her campaigning and most of her surrogates campaigning and most of her loyalists in the press, like Paul Krugman, are finding it very difficult to make a positive case for her. And I found this during the campaign too, the primary campaign too, that there was a real absence of a positive campaign for Hillary Clinton. And I kept trying to ask some of her faithful supporters, okay, make the case. Why is she so good? And they would often react with extreme anger that I even asked the question. It was misogynist to question her qualifications. You're just aiding Trump by bringing up any kinds of critical points about her political history or any of the scandals, of which there are plenty. It's just there's an unthinking, almost religious quality to the devotion to Hillary Clinton, which I don't understand. I don't understand precisely what the appeal of her is, but to her fans, they're so devoted yet so incapable of making a rational argument in her favor.
It was funny because, as Sanders gained momentum, eventually the case against him as leveled by the Hillary loyalists did turn to be mostly negative. I mean, he wasn't sufficiently intersectional enough. I mean, he wasn't,
Yeah, he probably had an intern fresh out of Brown who came up with that term.
Right, he wasn't sufficiently beloved by minority voters, which is a real liability for him, but the idea that somehow meant that Hillary was this great savior for, minority voters didn't seem to quite follow. And now, it's transitioned to the general election. First of all, she mostly hid for the month of August. Now we now know that she was ill, but she did a couple rallies, and then she spent the rest of her time, at these mega fundraisers in Beverly Hills or the Hamptons or Martha's Vineyard or whatnot.
Yeah, there were a couple of weeks. I think the second half of August, she was pulling in something like $150,000 an hour raising money. That's just a remarkable haul.
Yeah, but
That's
so
what she
so
feels
that's,
comfortable with. She feels comfortable with plutocrats in their mansions right now. She's much more, although, she tries to, when she launched the campaign, she was going to be the candidate for everyday Americans that now. She goes through so many reinventions in the course of a campaign, and she's always reintroducing herself to us and trying to humanize herself. She's been doing this for like 20, 25 years of these reintroductions and humanization campaigns. But you go back to the days of the everyday American when she was going to be fighting for the regular Joe and Joanna. Now she just seems so much more comfortable in the Hamptons or in Beverly Hills, talking to very rich people behind closed doors, that rather than doing the business of campaigning. Her husband was a sleazy character, and his politics were very dubious, but the guy was very skilled at campaigning, and obviously thrived on the sociability of it. She doesn't. She's very uncomfortable with that, and it shows, and it makes her. It's one of the reasons she's such a terrible candidate.
and have you noticed that the reason cited for why her retail campaigning doesn't tend to particularly resonate, that is blamed on the voters themselves rather than any flaw that she might exhibit, right? So there was this meme that was going around during the time of the Democratic convention. And maybe a week or two prior, Ezra Klein wrote this very laudatory and pseudo-wonkish profile on Hillary, who graced him with an interview, and said that the big problem with Hillary is that people don't sufficiently appreciate her listening ability. So she's a great world-renowned listener, and that's hard for her to communicate on the campaign trail. Because it's a traditionally male-oriented enterprise, which is just factually true. It is, it's been mostly males who have run for president and all males who have won the presidency, right? But that was then translated into a sort of an implicit denunciation of the voters for not being attuned to her listening skills, and then a little bit later during the convention, her listening abilities were touted by speaker after speaker. So it's never a flaw or a deficiency on her part that explains why she's not popular, or now even historically unpopular, even seen as less honest than Trump among millennials or young people. It's always something to do with the voters not being sufficiently appreciative of her.
Or the media as well. It's funny you mentioned the listening thing. She's gone on so many listening tours over her political career. She did one. She was considering running for Senate from the state of New York, a state where she had never lived and never showed much interest in until she decided to run for Senate. So she visited all the 62 counties in the state on a listening tour. She gives the appearance of listening. Now, but she's going to do what she wants to do. She'll do what the polls tell her to do, or what her contributors tell her to do, or what her staff tells her to do. But she's not going to listen to some farmer in upstate New York and act upon his or her insights or needs or interests. She's going to do what she wants to do, and what she wants to do is generally what the rich and powerful in the national security establishment want her to do. But another vector of blame that's becoming very popular now. Well, there are two. The press is being extremely unfair to Hillary. The press has always been very unfair to Hillary, and her husband as well. So this is what they call Clinton derangement syndrome.
Double standards.
Yeah, the New York Times is particularly seen as somehow anti-Clintonian, which strikes me as hilarious because the worldview of the New York Times and the worldview of the Clinton family are virtually identical, and so it's never any problems with Hillary as a candidate, or Hillary's politics, or her political practices, or her questionable ethics. It's always that the media are being very unfair to her, which is another way she reminds me of Richard Nixon, by the way. But now they're also another variation in this theme of blaming other people besides her is now that they're blaming Bernie for having left a poison residue after the primary. So somebody like Ed Kilgore, who is writes for New York Magazine, but is a former ideologist for the Democratic Leadership Council, the old New Democrat conservative formation that dissolved because it had successfully taken over the Democratic Party, which Bill and Hillary were among the early founders of. Kilgore is now saying that Sanders really poisoned the well and left Hillary now just so damaged for the general election campaign, and it's all his fault. And he's not being enthusiastic enough and is campaigning for her. And he's not being exactly enthusiastic. He's always said he would endorse her. He'd always said, Trump must be defeated. But, he's not exactly getting out there and shaking the pom-poms, and that's what they want him to do, and he's not doing it. But, it's not his fault that people just don't like her. And there are many reasons people don't like her. Some are misogynistic, I'll concede that. But, many aren't. And her people will not concede that there's any valid critique to be made of her.
And, Bernie must have forced her to deliver speeches for hundreds of thousands of dollars to widely despised Wall Street firms, right? And he must have also forced her to back virtually every failed military intervention that the U.S. has waged in the past 25 years, right? I mean, that was his fault.
Oh, it's all his fault. Yes, because that's just who he is. He also forced her to make that remark about the deplorables, which is just so politically stupid. To say that, again, they're blaming the voters.
Right.
And Trump has a lot of icky supporters. I will concede that, but there are a lot of people who support Trump for who knows what reasons. Like it's not just because they're baying racist ignoramuses, and that's all. The only understanding they have for why people would support Trump is that they're just bad people. And again, I will concede that many are, but many are not. And besides, whether you think they're bad people or not, you just don't campaign that way. You don't campaign by insulting a good portion of the voting public. It's just, especially at a fundraiser on Wall Street, at the Cipriani restaurant on Wall Street, surrounded by showbiz people and plutocrats. It's just such bad politics, and that's Bernie didn't make her do that. She did that, and she did that in the pneumonia in a single weekend, which was really two damaging blows to her campaign.
And I wrote about, and we'll wrap up in a little bit because I know you have to go, but I wrote about this in my advice column this past week, which drew attention to the famous race speech that Obama gave in the 2008 campaign. After the Jeremiah Wright so-called scandal erupted, he went and he tied the experiences of his white family, who have maybe racially tinged grievances, with the experiences of black people in Chicago who he lived amongst, who also have relatively similar grievances in the grand scheme of things. That was the way that he put it. Now, you might have problems with the way that was framed, and some of the I think are legitimate, but nevertheless, he kind of, even when he made his remark about the people in Pennsylvania bitterly clinging to their guns and religion, it wasn't a fundamentally accusatory remark. It was fundamentally descriptive, right? He was trying to explain and empathize with the reasons why voters behaved the way they did, whereas by contrast, Hillary seems to just be attacking them. I mean, she doesn't seem to have a capacity or desire to empathize, and her instinct seems to be to malign in a way that I don't think Obama's is.
Well, she does. He also does too. I mean, they come out of this culture of elite liberalism, and liberals are always lamenting the fact that the public thinks that they're elitists and snobs, but they are, and they have a contempt for the general public. Adolf Reed once said that there's a kind of political thinker that thinks that if we just get all the smart people together in the vineyard, we can solve the world's problems. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of culture that both she and Obama come out of. But Obama, I've been very critical of him since he first emerged on the scene, but I'm already starting to miss him.
Mm-hmm. Because in foreign policy, you'll miss him a lot.
Yeah, I mean, whoever succeeds him is likely to be more aggressive, especially if it's Hillary. But there's some core of decency and thoughtfulness about him. He's actually he's an intellectual of some sort. He actually thinks. He reads books, and there's, I don't know, some kind of humanity to him that politics aside, that seems makes him more likable than Hillary, who just seems like icy and robotic sometimes. There's just something missing in her, and she just doesn't seem like a natural politician.
And we're seeing that borne out now because Hillary's support among the so-called downscale whites, which is the term of art for whites without college degrees and of a lower socioeconomic status, they were much more supportive of Obama in both 2008 and 2012 than they are of Hillary this time around, at least according to the most recent polling data. Now, that could be in part because they have a greater affinity with Trump than they did with the previous two Republican nominees. But I think it's also because they had, just a genuinely greater affinity with Obama, who didn't, at least actively antagonize them. This is one of the reasons why Trump will very likely win, for example, the 2nd congressional district of Maine, which is good for one electoral vote, which is, overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly economically despondent. So it seems like that's these stylistic differences are having an actual electoral impact potentially.
Well, we also have to remember that in 2008, the economy was in crisis. We had all those years and years of war. The whole setup seemed corrupt and ossified and frightening, and people were looking for a relief, for a change. And Obama, and I think this is mostly fantasy at work, but Obama represented to people a chance for real, genuine change, and for a more peaceful, more egalitarian world. And he hasn't really delivered in that in a lot of ways, but that was the hope that people had when they voted for him in 2008. And look at Hillary Clinton now, 8 years later. She represents nothing but the status quo. Her political history goes back into the 1970s, but most relevantly, she and Bill Clinton were among the founders of the whole New Democrat movement that was going to be business friendly and tough on crime and aggressive abroad. And that whole DLC agenda is now like 25 years old, and whatever you thought of it then, it's certainly not appropriate to the problems of today. So here she is, this remnant of a different political past. And it's not just a function of her age, because Sanders is a breath of fresh air, but he's considerably older than she is. So it's not just age. But her politics are just tired. And for a country that really feels that things are on the wrong track, and that they're worried about their economic future, then some people are worried about the oceans rising around them. To have this kind of status quo candidate with all these ethical problems, all these scandals, she's so different from Obama 8 years ago that there's no way that she could ever be seen as a breath of fresh air. And Trump, as vulgar and destructive and horrifying as he can be, does at least represent to some people a change for business as usual. And there's a real desire among a lot of the public for a change from business as usual. And Hillary Clinton is business as usual.
And it's Trump who, for all his faults, and there are many, as you noted, he's the one who's voicing a structural critique of the system such as it is. I mean, he's the one who is going before the American public and saying, the past 15 years of perpetual war have been a disaster. The interventions have not been in the American national interest. He's going to do things a different way, and his way is not the ideal way by any stretch. But he's at least putting forward a far-reaching discussion of how people haven't been well served by their government, and Hillary has no capacity to do that. So what she's reaching for is this Putin propaganda tying Putin to Trump, which is just going completely off the rails. And it's amazing to me that it hasn't been more widely condemned, especially among the liberal left-leaning commentariat. And you have bizarre stuff like her alt-right denunciation speech, which elevated literally a bunch of internet trolls to the main enemy that everyone needs to be focused on in the country. So,
yes, Pepe the Frog, very scary figure. We have to worry about the Pepe threat. Yeah, the Putin stuff and the Russia stuff. It's like it's red baiting without any political content. At least the communists stood for something, and we're we're a threat in some sense to the established order. But I just don't understand this whole Putin. It has a lot of the emotional, psychological content of the old Cold War red baiting, but just Putin is not a communist. He's not Stalin, but it's wacko. But it's again they're having to. They have no positive campaign, so they have to jack up this threat, even if it's something that's largely invented.
Yeah, people like Neera Tanden would say, this is not red baiting because, like you said, Putin is not a communist. But and that's true. That's why people, myself and others, have used the term neo-McCarthyite, because there needs to be, because they're obviously echoing past sentiments that were marshaled against, liberals and Democrats to tie them to the Soviet Union. But now there actually is red baiting in that there's a new propaganda website out called PutinTrump.org. I hesitate to give it any kind of plug, but it's this big donor who made his fortune in the tech market in the 90s with Microsoft. Put out this website where they actually do put the hammer and sickle and transpose it on a Putin-Trump images. So it actually is red baiting.
I saw the logo to that. I didn't have the heart to click on it and find out more because it just seemed too depressing. But it is very, very creative to bring in the hammer and sickle in Putin's name, and Trump too. Trump is communist revolutionary for sure.
And the guy running the website is, as I learned this morning, the former president of the Center for Public Integrity and a former NPR journalist. So, I mean, that to me just encapsulates how the establishment is kind of imploding onto itself in reaction to this Trump thing, which isn't being, it's not being, it's a threat and it's something that needs to be seriously contended with. But the way it's being framed is just so out of proportion that people don't have any kind of coherent understanding of what actually he represents. I mean, and that's a whole other discussion, but to me, it's just gone completely bonkers.
Yeah, I need to go shortly, but I just maybe wrapping it up, I would say that this whole election is so, aside from the Sanders thing, which was one of the most hopeful things I've seen in politics in a long time, and makes me think that maybe the whole Occupy, Black Lives Matter phase of popular unrest is really having broad political effects, and that says good things about the future. So I will maintain that optimistic note. But at the elite level, everything seems so ossified and corrupt and insane that a society that can produce these two people as the leading candidates for what is still the most powerful office in the world has some very, very serious problems. It's really a society, I think, that is at the top, too. I think the American ruling class, this is has been my next book project for some time now, so I better start working on it. But I think the American elite is really a rotten formation now. It's become so poisoned by money and the short-term pursuit of money that is unable to think like a proper ruling class. It can't plan for the long term. It can't think for the long term. All it can think about is very short-term momentary advantage and profit maximization. And I think that this election, and then the stupidity of the coverage of it. But it's going on for almost 600 days, I believe, since I think Ted Cruz was the first one to announce about almost 2 years ago. I mean, and it's still not over yet. And it's been so brutal and stupid and mean, aside from the Sanders campaign, that it's just there's something very deeply wrong with a society that can produce an election like this. And it can be funny from time to time, but it's really just it's sad and sick and diseased.
Yeah, well, on that joyous note, let's wrap up. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Michael.
Take care.